Hello and welcome to the program. I am Deji Badimasi. Now, the issue of Nigeria's rising debt burden and subsidy payment is among the heated arguments in the country at the moment, as stakeholders in the public and private sector have expressed concerns over the country's fiscal sustainability amidst dwindling national revenue. Weeks after President Muhammadu Buhari presented the proposed appropriation bill to the joint session of the National Assembly, the Minister of Finance, Zainab Ahmed, has given a breakdown of the document to the public. According to the minister, 3.36 trillion naira has been allocated for fuel subsidy in the 2023 budget as Nigeria's debt profile hits $102 billion. She further explained that the proposed budget has a deficit of 10.78 trillion naira, which will be funded through domestic and multilateral borrowings, as well as proceeds from privatization. Now, according to her, of Nigeria's $102 billion debt, 35% is foreign and 65% is domestic, while the current public debt is at 23% of the country's gross domestic product. Now, pointing out that the 2023 budget also factored in 17.16% inflation, the minister clarified that the 3.3 trillion naira allocated to subsidy payment is for January to June 2023, when subsidy will be suspended. Now, that amount of money for subsidy payment is actually humongous. Joining me now on the program to discuss this further is economist and the CEO of Carry Assets Management, Johnson Chuku. Mr. Chuku, thank you very much for joining us on the program. You know, some very, if you like, I don't know the word to use now, horrific figures, I may say. And, you know, this 3.36 trillion naira now that the minister said has been set aside for subsidy now could actually rise if subsidy is not removed by June next year. I mean, if it continues till December next year. Just give us your take on, you know, the breakdown that the minister gave and what your concerns are.
Thank you, Deji, for having me. My concerns are not far from the concern you just expressed now. We're talking of an expenditure about 3.36 trillion naira in the first half of the year as subsidy payment. And this subsidy does not in any way help in productive activities, does not contribute to the productivity in the economy. Yes, you could say that we are buying fuel at lower than market prices. But the questions are, have that in any way contributed to improving the competitiveness of the economy? Has that made the Nigerian citizens to be living better standard of living? Or has that improved the level of poverty in the country? I mean, reduced the level of poverty in the country? The answer is no. But beyond that, we're talking of a budget that has a deficit of more than 10 trillion naira. We're talking of an expenditure profile of 10.51 trillion naira, while as total government revenue is just 9.7 trillion naira. So you're talking of a budget deficit of about 11 trillion naira. And out of that amount, the first 6 months of the year will subsidy will account for 3.36 trillion naira, which ordinarily, if you take out that subsidy, then you will reduce this deficit for the entire year by as much as 3 trillion naira or 3.6 trillion naira. So if you're talking about 11.1 trillion deficit, you'll be talking of a deficit of something in the neighborhood of 8 trillion naira. But if you also consider the fact that that is just for the first half of the year, so in effect, the full impact of a subsidy in the whole year is something close to approximately 7 trillion naira. And the question is that do we really need this as a critical expense? Is it an important and inevitable expense that we must incur? Are there better use of national resources for that can be deployed at? Look at the capital expenditure budget, it's 5.35 trillion naira. So in effect, subsidy alone is almost as high as the entire capital expenditure. At least more than 50% of the capital expenditure. And then when you add that to debt service, about 6.3 trillion naira, then you're talking of expenses that will not in any way manifest in improving the economic environment of the country.
So this is like a fish bone in the throat of government. How should the government deal with this? Because if you ask me, in my opinion, even paying this subsidy till June next year, it's just not sustainable. But the government is willing to do it.
You know, Deji, my take is that the government at this point in time, the president is not running for any re-election. It's a burden that the country's economy cannot afford to continue to carry. And my take is that the current government should be fair to the incoming government and take out the subsidy. In the first place, Nigerians have gotten to a point where the deterioration of standard of living to the extent that, look, if you communicate with Nigerians and explain to them why the subsidy has to go, I guess that a lot of Nigerians will see reason with you. So it's the intention of the government had actually come up with a well-developed plan to take out subsidy earlier this year. But unfortunately, they backtracked on that, and they now have decided to extend it by 1 year to June next year. So I think it's something that is, the government has enough political capital to take it out. The citizens at this point...
But I'm just wondering, do you think it'll be wise to do that at this time? When you consider the cost of living crisis that we're having to deal with, do you think this could be the right time to do it?
You know, the interesting thing is that it's just a matter of priority. When you talk of that it's not the right thing to do it, the truth is that we are all bearing these costs. The total federal government, federal collected revenue for this year as budgeted by the Mr. President is about 16.87 trillion naira. And what have they done? They have deducted, before arriving at the federal collected revenue, that 3.36 trillion naira. In effect, federally collected revenue could have been 19.87 or 20 trillion naira. But we have deducted this upfront. So in effect, you and I have paid for it. So when we talk of high cost of standard of living and all these factors, it is because this is contributing to it. So if we take this out, the other fiscal framework will be adjusted. And they'll be surprised that what we, including the pressures we're having on the exchange rate, because we're importing more fuel than we ordinarily would have imported if we had taken out the subsidy, because we're also subsidizing consumption in neighboring African countries. So in effect, even the pressure you're having on your reserve and the foreign exchange rate will moderate if you reduce the amount of fuel you're importing today. So the reality is that when we talk of this and we're saying Nigerians will suffer, Nigerians are already suffering full impact of this subsidy because the resources that would have gone into other critical sectors that are more effective in cushioning the impact of the economic crisis is now forfeited or forgone for the benefit of subsidy.
Let's talk about our debt profile now. $102 billion. What's your take on that? We're planning to borrow more to fund next year's budget. Even though we're going to have another government, I mean, that government would somehow, you look at it, however you turn it, however you look at it, it would seem, well, that the new government would still have to borrow to fund the budget.
Yes, but the new government will adopt a different approach from the current government. Obviously, because the National Assembly has not stepped down their feet to ensure that we respect the letters of the Fiscal Responsibility Act. And that's why the government has gone on borrowing binge. If you consider the fact that even if you look at the current budget, I mean, there's no reason why on earth you should have a projected revenue of 9.7 trillion naira, which may not even be realized. And at the same time, you're budgeting to spend 20.51 trillion naira. Because you know the National Assembly will approve. Ordinarily, that's a breach of the Fiscal Responsibility Act, because it shouldn't be, a budget shouldn't be more than 3% of the GDP. But this is going to be about 5% of the GDP. But beyond that, you are planning to raise 9.7 trillion naira. You want to borrow from the local market economy 8.8 trillion naira and take another 1.77 trillion naira from bilateral and multilateral partners. So I think the next government will certainly not want to go into that. That's why we have built up this level of debt. I think at the last count, our total national debt was in naira terms was about 42 trillion naira. So if you add another 8 trillion naira to it, you'll be about 50 trillion naira or 51 trillion naira by the end of next year, assuming we even achieve our revenue projection inflation of 9.7 trillion naira, which may be difficult because the government has consistently met its expenditure budget because it can borrow. And then if you look at the first 8 months of this year, I think the Minister of Finance said total federal government revenue about 4.6 trillion naira, while as debt service was about 3.5 trillion naira. So in effect, debt service was almost consumed the entire federal government revenue in the first 8 months of this year. So that's where the challenge is, because it then means that we're borrowing for virtually every recurrent expenditure of the government and every capital expenditure of the government. And clearly, that's not sustainable. We had periods in the past where debt service was more than 100% of the government revenue. And that clearly says that despite the debt to GDP of 23%, our debt service to GDP, to revenue, has made the debt unsustainable.
Finally, let's talk about the projected inflation rate. You think that's feasible? 17 point something percent?
I doubt if that can be achieved next year. Of course, I don't expect the current trend to continue throughout next year, because at some point you're going to be dealing with the base effect.
Especially when you look at the flooding that we're having to deal with now and the impact it could have long term.
Yes, you're going to have inflation rate in the next couple of months, maybe in the next 3 months or 6 months, remain elevated, but subsequently you're going to see inflation rate moderate. And why is it going to moderate? If you consider the fact that the inflation rate for September was 20.77%, so you are going to have additional increase in prices about more than 20.77% by September next year for you to for the inflation rate to come at current rates. So because we are going to be dealing with a high base effect, so you may see a lower inflation rate as we move towards the end of next year. But I don't know whether it can drop as low as 17.6%. But bear in mind that inflation calculation is based year-on-year changes in price levels. And because we are dealing with the already high level of prices, so the increment we may see in the next couple of months may not be at the same rate that we've seen in the past 12 months. Okay. So that's why we will see a moderation inflation rate. But cumulatively, you're going to see Nigeria will still be dealing with high inflation figures.
And finally, what do you think, economically speaking now, what do you think would be the biggest challenge that the next government would have to deal with?
Well, I think the first thing is that the government has to find a way of creating employment, which means we have to look at sectors of the economy that the government can quickly have quick wins, where productivity will improve and you can see immediate growth in those sectors. And without that, we are going to be dealing with some level of social unrest that we can't contend with. Of course, you can see a lot of young people agitated, and they are all hopeful that after the election, the fortunes of the country will improve and their fortunes will improve. So you must look for quick wins that will create economic activities, that will create employment opportunities for people to be gainfully employed. That, for me, is the first thing the new government must focus on.
Well, Mr. Johnson Chuku, thank you very much for your time, and thank you for talking to us.
My pleasure.
Thank you so very much. We'll take a short break and we'll be right back. Don't go away.